Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back again with more Insurgent Mexico. Today we'll be picking up chapter 5 here. Chapter 6. So, yeah. Anyway, let's jump into this. Chapter 5. The funeral of Abram Gonzalez. The fact that Villa hates useless pomp and ceremony makes it more impressive when he does appear on public occasion. He has the knack of absolutely expressing the strong feeling of the great mass of the people. In February, exactly 1 year after Abram Gonzalez was murdered by the Federals at Baquimba Canyon, Villa ordered a great funeral ceremony to be held in the city of Chihuahua. 2 trains carrying the officers of the army, the consuls, and the representatives of the foreign colony left Chihuahua early in the morning to take up the body of the dead governor from its resting place under a rude wooden cross in the desert. Villa ordered Major Fierro, his superintendent of railroads, to get the trains ready. But Fierro got drunk and forgot. And when Villa and his brilliant staff arrived at the railway station the next morning, the regular passenger train to Juarez was just leaving and there was no other equipment on hand. Villa himself leaped onto the already moving engine and compelled the engineer to back the train up to the station. Then he walked through the train, ordering the passengers out, and switched it in the direction of Baquimba. They had no sooner started than he summoned Fierro before him and discharged him from the superintendency of the railroads, appointing Calzado in his place, and ordered the latter to return at once to Chihuahua and be thoroughly informed about the railroads by the time he returned. At Baquimba, Villa stood silently by the grave with the tears rolling down his cheeks, for Gonzalez had been his close friend. 10,000 people stood in the heat and dust at Chihuahua railway station when the funeral train arrived and poured weeping through the narrow streets behind the army, at the head of which walked Villa beside the hearse. His automobile was waiting, and he angrily refused to ride, stumbling stubbornly along in the dirt of the streets with his eyes on the ground. That night there was a velada in the Theater of the Heroes, an immense auditorium packed with emotional peons and their women. The ring of boxes was brilliant when officers in their full dress and wedged behind them up the 5 high balconies were the ragged poor. Now the velada is an entirely Mexican institution. First there comes a speech, then a recitation on the piano, then a speech, followed by a patriotic song rendered by a chorus of awkward little Indian girls from the public school with squeaky voices, another speech, and a soprano solo from Trovatore by the wife of some government official. Still, there is a prominent funeral, or a national holiday, or a president's anniversary, or in fact, on occasion of the least importance, a velada must be held. It is the conventional and respectable way of celebrating anything. Villa sat in the left-hand stage box and controlled the proceedings by tapping a little bell. The stage itself was brilliantly hideous with black portraits or black bunning, huge masses of artificial flowers, abominable crayon portraits of Madero, Pino Suarez, and the dead governor, and red, white, and green electric lights. At the foot of all this was a very small, plain, black wooden box which held the body of Abram Gonzalez. The velada proceeded in an orderly and exhausting manner for about 2 hours. Local orators, trembling with stage fright, mouthed the customary Castilian extravagant phrases, and little girls stepped on their own feet and murmured Tosti's goodbye. Villa, with his eyes riveted on that wooden box, never moved nor spoke. At the proper time, he mechanically tapped the little bell, but after a while, he couldn't stand it any longer. A large, fleshy Mexican was in the middle of Handel's Largo on the grand piano when Villa stood erect. He put his foot on the coffin in his arms. Handel's Largo petered out. Silent astonishment paralyzed the audience. Holding the black box tenderly in his arms as a mother with her baby, not looking at anyone, Villa started down the steps of the stage and up the aisle. Instinctively, the house rose, and as he passed out through the swinging doors, they followed on silently behind him. He strode down between the lines of waiting soldiers, his sword banging on the floor across the dark square to the governor's palace, and with his own hands put the coffin on the flower bank table, waiting for it in the audience hall. It had been arranged that 4 generals in turn should stand the death watch, each for 2 hours. Candles shed a dim light over the darkness. A dense mass of silent, breathing people packed the doorway. Villa unbuckled his sword and threw it clattering into the corner. Then he took his rifle from the table and stood the first watch. Chapter 6. Villa and Carranza. It seems incredible to those who don't know him that this remarkable figure, who has risen from obscurity to the most prominent position in Mexico in 3 years, should not covet the presidency of the Republic. But that is in entire accordance with the simplicity of his character. When asked about it, he answered as always with perfect directness, just in the way that you put it to him. He didn't quibble over whether he could or could not be president of Mexico. He said, "I am a fighter, not a statesman. I am not educated enough to be president. I only learned to read and write 2 years ago. How could I, who never went to school, hope to be able to talk with the foreign ambassadors and the cultivated gentlemen of the Congress? It would be bad for Mexico if an uneducated man were to be the president. There is one thing that I will not do, and that is to take a position for which I am not fitted. There is only one order of my jefe, Carranza, which I would refuse to obey. If he would command me to be a president or a governor, On behalf of my paper, I had to ask him this question 5 or 6 times. Finally, he became exasperated. "I have told you many times," he said, "that there is no possibility of my becoming president of Mexico. Are the newspapers trying to make trouble between me and my jefe? This is the last time that I will answer that question. The next correspondent that asks me, I will have him spanked and sent to the border." 4 days afterward, he went around grumbling humorously about the chatito, pug-nose, who kept asking him whether he wanted to be the president of Mexico. The idea seemed to amuse him. Whenever I went to see him after that, he used to say at the end of our talk, "Well, aren't you going to ask me today whether I want to be the president?" He never referred to Carranza except as my jefe, and he obeyed implicitly the slightest order from the first chief of the revolution. His loyalty to Carranza was perfectly obstinate. He seemed to think that in Carranza were embodied the entire ideas of the revolution. This in spite of the fact that many of his advisors tried to make him see that Carranza was essentially an aristocrat and a reformer, and that the people were fighting for more than reform. Carranza's political program, as set forth in the Plan of Guadalupe, carefully avoids any promise of settlement of the land question, except a vague endorsement of Madero's plan of San Luis Potosi, and it is evident that he does not intend to advocate any radical restoration of the land to the people until he becomes provisional president, and then to proceed very cautiously. In the meantime, he seems to have left it to Villa's judgment, as well as all other details of the conduct of the revolution in the north. But Villa, being a peon and feeling with them rather than consciously reasoning it out that the land question is the real cause of the revolution, acted with characteristic promptness and directness. No sooner had he settled the details of government in Chihuahua State and appointed Chow his provisional governor than he issued a proclamation giving 62 1/2 acres out of the confiscated lands to every male citizen of the state, and declaring these lands inalienable for any cause for a period of 10 years. In the state of Durango, the same thing has happened, and other states are free of federal garrisons. He will pursue the same policy. Chapter 7. The Rules of War. In the field, too, Villa had to invent an entirely original method of warfare because he never had a chance to learn anything of accepted military strategy. In that, he is without the possibility of any doubt the greatest leader Mexico has ever had. His method of fighting is astonishingly like Napoleon's. Secrecy, quickness of movement, and adaptation of his plans to the character of the country and of his soldiers, the value of intimate relations with the rank and file, and of the building up a tradition among the enemy that his army is invincible, and that he himself bears a charmed life. These are his characteristics. He knew nothing of accepted European standards of strategy or of discipline. One of the troubles of the Mexican Federal Army is that its officers are thoroughly saturated with conventional military theory. The Mexican soldier is still mentally at the end of the 18th century. He is, above all, a loose individual guerrilla fighter. Red tape simply paralyzes the machine. When Villa's army goes into battle, he is not hampered by salutes or rigid respect for officers or trigonometrical calculations of the trajectories of projectiles or theories of the percentage of hits in 1,000 rounds of rifle fire or the function of cavalry, infantry, and artillery in any particular position, or rigid obedience to the secret knowledge of its superiors. It reminds one of the ragged Republican army that Napoleon led into Italy. It is probable that Villa doesn't know much about those things himself, but he does know that guerrilla fighters cannot be driven blindly into platoons around the field in perfect step, that men fighting individually and of their own free will are braver than the long volleying rows in the trenches lashed to it by officers with the flat of their swords. And there the fighting is fiercest, and a ragged mob of fierce brown men with hand bombs and rifles rush the bullet-swept streets of an ambushed town. Villa is among them, like any common soldier. Up to his day, Mexican armies had always carried with them hundreds of the women and children of the soldiers. Villa was the first man to think of swift forced marches of bodies of cavalry, leaving their women behind. Up to this time, no Mexican army had ever abandoned its base. It had always struck close to the railroad and the supply trains. But Villa struck terror into the enemy by abandoning his trains and throwing his entire effective army upon the field, and he did it at Gomez Palacio. He invented in Mexico the most demoralizing form of battle, the night attack. When, after the fall of Torreon last September, he withdrew his entire army in the face of Orozco's advance from Mexico City and for 5 days unsuccessfully attacked Chihuahua, it was a terrible shock to the federal general when he waked up one morning and found that Villa had sneaked around the city under cover of darkness, captured a freight train of terrazas, and descended with his entire army upon the comparatively undefended city of Juarez. It wasn't fair. Villa found that he hadn't enough trains to carry all his soldiers, even when he had ambushed and captured a federal troop train sent south by General Castro, the federal commander in Juarez. So he telegraphed that gentleman as follows, signing the name of the colonel in command of the troop train. Engine broken down at Moctezuma. Send another engine and 5 cars. The unsuspecting Castro immediately dispatched a new train. Villa then telegraphed him, "Wires cut between here and Chihuahua. Largo force of rebels approaching from south. What shall I do?" Castro replied, "Return at once," and Villa obeyed, telegraphing cheering messages at every station along the way. The federal commander got wind of his coming about an hour before he arrived and left, without informing his garrison, so that outside of a small massacre, Villa took Juarez almost without a shot. And with the border so near, he managed to smuggle across enough ammunition to equip his almost armless forces, and a week later sallied out and routed the pursuing federal forces with great slaughter at Tierra Blanca. General Hugh L. Scott, in command of the American troops at Fort Bliss, sent Villa a little pamphlet containing the rules of war adopted by the Hague Conference. He spent hours poring over it. It interested and amused him hugely. He said, "What is this Hague Conference? Was there a representative of Mexico there? Was there a representative of the Constitutionalists there? It seems to me a funny thing to make rules about war. It's not a game. What is the difference between civilized war and any other kind of war? If you and I are having a fight in a cantina, we are not going to pull a little book out of our pockets and read over the rules. It says here that you must not use lead bullets, but I don't see why not. They do the work." For a long time afterward, he went around popping questions at his officers like this: "If an invading army takes a city of the enemy, what must you do with the women and children?" As far as I could see, the rules of war didn't make any difference in Villa's original method of fighting. The Colorados he executed wherever he captured them, because he said they were peons like the revolutionists, and that no peon would volunteer against the cause of liberty unless he were bad. The federal officers also he killed because he explained they were educated men and ought to know better. But the federal common soldiers he set at liberty because most of them were conscripts and thought that they were fighting for the patria. There is no case on record where he wantonly killed a man. Anyone he did so, he promptly executed, except Fierro. Fierro, the man who killed Benton, was known as the Butcher throughout the army. He was a great, handsome animal, the best and cruelest rider and fighter, perhaps in all the revolutionary forces. In his furious lust for blood, Fierro used to shoot down 100 prisoners with his own revolver, only stopping long enough to reload. He killed for the pure joy of it. During 2 weeks that I was in Chihuahua, Fierro killed 15 inoffensive citizens in cold blood, but there was always a curious relationship between him and Villa. He was Villa's best friend, and Villa loved him like a son and always pardoned him. But Villa, although he had never heard of the rules of war, carried with his army the only field hospital of any effectiveness that any Mexican army has ever carried. It consisted of 40 boxcars enameled inside, fitted with operating tables and all the latest appliances of surgery, and manned by more than 60 doctors and nurses. Every day during the battle, shuttle trains full of the desperately wounded ran from the front to the base hospitals at Parral, Jimenez, and Chihuahua. He took care of the federal wounded just as carefully as his own men. Ahead of his own supply train when another train carrying 2,000 sacks of flour and also corn, coffee, sugar, and cigarettes to feed the entire starving population of the country around Durango City and Torreon. The common soldiers adore him for his bravery and his coarse, blunt humor. Often I've seen him slouched on his cot in the little red caboose in which he always traveled, cracking jokes familiarly with 20 ragged privates sprawled on the floor, chairs and tables. When the army was in training or detraining, Villa personally would be on hand in a dirty old suit without a collar, kicking mules in the stomach and pushing horses in and out of the stock cars. Getting thirsty all of a sudden, he would grab some soldier's canteen and drain it, in spite of the indignant protests of the owner, and then tell him to go over the river and say that Pancho Villa said that he should fill it there. But yeah, that's the end of that particular episode. So we're getting further looks at Pancho Villa. We have a few more chapters about Villa. Well, there we go. A people in arms. Oh, we're just about finished with part 2. It looks like it's got one more chapter. Jimenez and Points West. Dona Luisa's Hotel, Chapter 1 on Part 3. Okay. But yeah. So we're getting to see how much a man of the people Pancho Villa actually is. You know, he's always fighting alongside them, making sure there's a way to at least keep them alive. You know, keeping medical transport and supplies, and even busy feeding the people around. He even talks about there's even the author talks about how Villa showed compassion to the federal regulars, because he said those were conscripts. They didn't have a choice in fighting. He's like, look, I'm not a brutal killer. You know, some people have no excuses, but others, it's out of their own control. So you can't fault them necessarily. But yeah. And then laughing at the rules of war by The Hague, which is something we have to this day, you know. International Court in The Hague, which is in Netherlands. I think it's in Netherlands. That's where The Hague is at. But yeah, Villa's like, we're fighting for freedom. for equality. You know, this isn't a game. You know, this is war. But yeah. Um. But yeah, Villa does a lot. We get a much further look at who Villa is as an individual. But that'll be the end of this episode. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, learn, study. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.